The doctor said it was impossible. The neurologist looked Margaret Sullivan straight in the eye and told her she'd spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. But on a warm June evening in 2023, in a decorated barn in rural Connecticut, a 72-year-old grandmother did something that made 200 wedding guests rise to their feet in tears. What happened in that moment wasn't just a dance. It was a miracle 20 years in the making, and the story of how she got there, well, it's something you need to hear. To understand what Margaret achieved, you first need to know who she was before everything changed. Margaret Sullivan wasn't always a grandmother in the wheelchair. There was a time when she moved through life, like she was dancing even when she wasn't. She'd been a ballet teacher for 37 years, running her own small studio in Fairfield County. Every afternoon, she'd tie up her silver hair, lace her worn ballet slippers, and teach young girls how to find grace in their own bodies. Her daughter, Emma, remembered watching her mother demonstrate a perfect arabesque well into her 60s. She made it look effortless, Emma would later say, like her body was having a conversation with the music that the rest of us couldn't quite hear. Margaret had always said that dancing wasn't just movement. It was freedom. It was joy made visible. It was a language she spoke when English wasn't enough. And then, in the spring of 2003, that language was stolen from her. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Margaret was driving to her studio, thinking about the recital coming up in 3 weeks. She choreographed a piece to Debussy that she was particularly proud of. The youngest girls, the 6-year-old in their pale pink leotards, were finally getting the timing right. She never saw the pickup truck run the red light. The impact sent her sedan spinning across the intersection. When the paramedics pulled her from the wreckage 40 minutes later, Margaret was conscious but couldn't feel her legs. At the hospital, a surgeon with kind eyes and a grave expression told her family what they already feared: severe spinal cord injury, multiple fractured vertebrae, extensive nerve damage. The surgery took 11 hours. When Margaret woke up 2 days later, the neurologist, Dr. Richard Hayes, a man who delivered difficult news hundreds of times, sat beside her bed and spoke with careful, measured words. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need you to understand the reality of your situation. The damage to your spinal cord is significant. With intensive physical therapy, you may regain some upper body mobility, but..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The likelihood of you walking again is virtually non-existent. I'm sorry, but I need to be honest with you. You need to prepare yourself for life in a wheelchair." Margaret didn't cry. Not then. She just stared at the white ceiling tiles and thought about all those little girls in pink leotards, waiting for a teacher who would never dance again. But here's where the story takes its first turn. Because that night, when Emma came to visit her mother in the hospital, she brought someone with her. Someone small. Someone who didn't understand words like permanent or impossible. 4-year-old Lily, Margaret's only granddaughter, climbed onto the hospital bed with the fearless confidence only children possess. She wrapped her tiny arms around her grandmother's neck and whispered into her ear, "Grandma Maggie, when I get married someday, will you dance with me?" Margaret felt her throat tighten. Emma tried to pull Lily away, to explain that Grandma couldn't dance anymore, but Margaret held up her hand. She looked into her granddaughter's bright hazel eyes that held no doubt, no awareness of limitations. And she made a promise that everyone in that room knew she couldn't keep. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret whispered. "When you get married, I'll dance with you." Emma's eyes filled with tears. The nurses pretended not to hear. Dr. Hayes, standing in the doorway finishing his rounds, shook his head slightly and walked away. But Margaret meant every word. The months that followed were brutal in ways that broken bones and surgical pain could never capture. Margaret went through physical therapy 3 times a week. She learned how to transfer from bed to wheelchair, how to navigate doorways, how to accept help from strangers. She learned the weight of pity in people's eyes and the sting of her own uselessness. Her ballet studio closed. Her insurance barely covered half the medical bills. Her husband, Tom, worked double shifts at the Postal Service to make ends meet, coming home exhausted to care for a wife who sometimes didn't want to be cared for. There were dark nights when Margaret wondered if staying alive was worth the effort. when a woman who'd spent her life teaching others to move gracefully couldn't even make it to the bathroom without assistance. But then Lily would visit, and Lily never treated her grandmother like she was broken. Lily would spin in circles in the living room, her arms outstretched, and beg Margaret to watch her dance. She'd put on Margaret's old ballet recordings and try to copy the movements she saw on the grainy VHS tapes. And every few months, without fail, she'd ask the same question. "Grandma, you didn't forget our promise, right? You'll dance at my wedding." And every time, Margaret would smile through the ache in her chest and say, "I didn't forget, sweetheart." What nobody knew, not Emma, not Tom, not even the physical therapist who'd given up pushing her try, was that Margaret had made a secret decision. She was going to walk again. Not might, not maybe, would. And if walking was possible, then dancing was too. The doctors had said it was impossible. The insurance company had stopped covering therapy after 18 months, declaring her condition permanent and stable. Everyone had moved on to acceptance. Everyone except Margaret. At 53 years old, Margaret began a second education. She read everything she could find about spinal cord injuries, nerve regeneration, neuroplasticity. She discovered stories online, rare, miraculous stories, of people who'd been told never, but somehow found eventually. She contacted researchers. She emailed specialists across the country. Most never wrote back. Some told her kindly but firmly that she needed to accept reality. A few, just a few, said something different. One physical therapist in Boston, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chun, who specialized in impossible cases, wrote back with 5 words that changed everything. "I've seen stranger things happen." Tom uses vacation days to drive Margaret to Boston once a month. Dr. Chin didn't make promises. She made Margaret work harder than she'd ever worked in her life. "The body remembers," Dr. Chin would say, manipulating Margaret's unresponsive legs through movements they'd long forgotten. "Your brain knows how to walk. We just have to remind it how to send the message." The progress was microscopic. 6 months in, Margaret could wiggle 3 toes on her right foot. Tom cried when she showed him. It was the first movement below her waist in nearly 2 years. A year after that, she could flex her ankle. Then, slowly, painfully, she could bend her knee. But standing, walking, those still seemed like distant dreams. And then, in the spring of 2022, Lily called with news that made Margaret's heart soar and break simultaneously. She was engaged. At 23, Lily had met a kind young man named Daniel, a schoolteacher with a gentle smile and a love for old movies. They were planning a wedding for June 2023, a barn wedding in Connecticut, with string lights and wildflowers and dancing under the stars. "I'm so happy, Grandma," Lily said over the phone, her voice bright with joy. "And I know we made that promise when I was little, and I know you can't. I don't expect. I just want you there, okay? That's all I need. Just you being there is enough." Margaret closed her eyes. 19 years had passed since she made that promise in the hospital. Lily was letting her off the hook with grace and love. But Margaret wasn't ready to be let off the hook. "Lily," she said quietly, "what's the date?" "June 17th. "Why?" Margaret looked at the calendar. 14 months away. "No reason, sweetheart. Congratulations." After she hung up, Margaret called Dr. Chin in Boston. "I need to accelerate everything," Margaret said. "I have 14 months. I made a promise I intend to keep." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Dr. Chin said, "Let's get to work." What happened over those 14 months was nothing short of extraordinary. Margaret trained 6 days a week. She worked with Dr. Chin via video calls, following a brutal regimen designed for someone half her age. She used resistance bands. She practiced standing with parallel bars until her arms shook with exhaustion. She fell. God, she fell so many times. But she got back up. Tom converted their garage into a makeshift therapy room. On weekends, Emma would come over to help, watching in amazement as her mother, this woman who'd been told never, slowly, impossibly, began to prove everyone wrong. By month 6, Margaret could stand for 30 seconds. By month 9, she could take 3 steps between the parallel bars. By month 12, She could walk 20 feet with a walker. But dancing? That was still beyond reach. Her legs were weak. Her balance was terrible. She'd spent 2 decades in a wheelchair, and her 72-year-old body was being asked to perform a miracle. Emma tried to talk sense into her. "Mom, you've already done the impossible. You don't need to dance. Just walking Lily down the aisle would be—" "I made a promise," Margaret said firmly. "I'm keeping it." 3 months before the wedding, Margaret did something she kept secret even from Tom. She contacted her old studio, the one that had closed after her accident. It had been bought by a former student of hers, a woman named Rachel, who now taught the next generation of dancers. Margaret asked if she could use the studio early in the mornings, before classes started. Rachel, who'd been 9 years old when Margaret taught her how to do a proper plie, said yes without hesitation. 3 times a week at 6 in the morning, Tom would drive Margaret to the studio. Rachel would be there, waiting, and in that familiar space, the same mirrors, the same bar, the same floor where Margaret had spent 37 years teaching grace, the old ballet teacher began to learn how to dance again. It was ugly at first. Margaret could barely lift her legs. Her turns were clumsy. Her balance was non-existent. But Rachel, patient and kind, worked with her like Margaret had once worked with frightened 6-year-olds. "You're not trying to be perfect," Rachel reminded her. "You're just trying to move with love." They chose a simple song. Nothing fancy. Just 45 seconds of gentle movement that Margaret could manage. A grandmother-granddaughter dance that would surprise no one with technical brilliance, but would mean everything in its existence. Margaret practiced every day. Some mornings she cried from frustration. Other mornings she cried from joy when she completed a sequence without falling. Tom never told her what he saw on her face during those months, but he knew. He was watching his wife come back to life. June 17th, 2023, dawned clear and warm. The barn in rural Connecticut was decorated with mason jars filled with wildflowers and string lights that would glow when the sun set. Lily was radiant in her simple lace dress. Daniel couldn't stop smiling. 200 friends and family filled the wooden chairs. And in the front row, in her wheelchair, sat Margaret Sullivan. She'd kept her plans secret from Lily. She didn't want to promise something she might not be able to deliver. Even that morning, getting dressed in her pale blue dress, she wasn't sure her body would cooperate. But she'd made a promise 19 years ago. And today, she'd find out if she could keep it. The ceremony was beautiful. When the officiant pronounced Lily and Daniel husband and wife, there wasn't a dry eye in the barn. The reception began with dinner, speeches, and laughter. The sun started to set, and the string lights flickered on, turning the barn into something magical. And then the DJ announced the first dance. Lily and Daniel swayed together to a sweet, simple song, wrapped in each other and in a love that felt like it could light the world. When the song ended, the DJ's voice came over the speakers. "And now, the bride has requested a special dance with her grandmother." Lily turned, her eyes finding Margaret in the wheelchair near the edge of the dance floor. She walked over, bent down, and took her grandmother's hands. "Grandma, I know we made that promise when I was little, but—" Margaret squeezed her hands. "Lily, sweetheart, do you remember what I told you in the hospital? You said you'd dance with me. And have I ever broken a promise to you?" Lily's eyes filled with tears. "No, but—" Margaret took a deep breath. And then, with Tom suddenly at her side offering his arm, she did something she hadn't told anyone she was going to do. She stood up. The barn went completely silent. 200 people watched as Margaret Sullivan, the woman who'd been told she'd never walk again, rose from her wheelchair. Emma gasped. Lily's hands flew to her mouth. Daniel steadied his new bride as her knees went weak. Margaret stood, trembling but upright, her hand gripping Tom's arm. And then, step by careful step, she walked toward the dance floor. She made it 5 steps, 10 steps, 15, and then she was there, in the center of the floor, standing in front of her granddaughter with tears streaming down both their faces. The opening notes of their song began. It was "What a Wonderful World" by Louis Armstrong. Simple, gentle, perfect. And Margaret Sullivan danced with her granddaughter at her wedding. It wasn't a perfect dance. Margaret's steps were small and careful. She leaned on Lily for support, and Lily held her grandmother like she was made of precious glass. They swayed more than they stepped. Margaret's movements were nothing like the graceful arabesques she'd once demonstrated with ease. But it was the most beautiful dance anyone in that barn had ever seen. As they moved together under the string lights, Lily whispered through her tears, "You kept your promise." "I told you I would," Margaret whispered back. "I just needed something worth fighting for. Was I really worth all of this?" Margaret pulled back just enough to look into her granddaughter's eyes. Those same hazel eyes that held no doubt 19 years ago in a hospital room. "Lily, you were worth every impossible day, every fall, every moment I wanted to give up, but didn't. You were worth all of it because you believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. That little girl who asked me to dance, she saved my life." Around them, 200 people were openly sobbing. Emma had collapsed into her husband's arms. Tom was wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. Rachel, the former student who'd helped make this possible, was filming on her phone with shaking hands. Dr. Chin would later say, when the video reached her in Boston, that in 30 years of rehabilitation medicine, she'd never seen anything like it. Dr. Hayes, the neurologist who told Margaret it was impossible, would see the video too. He'd call her a month later to apologize for his limitations and to ask if he could share her story with other patients who needed hope. But in that moment, none of that mattered. In that moment, there was just a grandmother and her granddaughter dancing under string lights in a Connecticut barn, proving that some promises are worth keeping no matter how impossible they seem. The dance lasted 45 seconds. When the song ended, Tom and Daniel helped Margaret back to her wheelchair. She was exhausted, shaking, and happier than she'd been in 20 years. Later that night, after the cake was cut and the bouquet was thrown, Lily sat beside her grandmother and asked a question that was on everyone's mind. "How did you do it, Grandma? The doctor said you'd never walk again." Margaret smiled. She was tired down to her bones, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from achieving something you once thought impossible. "I did it because I made you a promise," she said simply. "And because a very wise little girl once taught me that sometimes the people who love us see possibilities we can't see ourselves. You never doubted I could dance with you. You never treated me like I was broken. You just kept believing. And eventually, your belief became mine." She reached out and took Lily's hand. The doctors were right about the odds. They were right about the medical reality. But they were wrong about one thing. They forgot to account for love. They forgot that sometimes, when you have someone worth fighting for, your body finds a way to do things science says shouldn't be possible. Margaret Sullivan lives in Connecticut with her husband, Tom. She uses her wheelchair most days. The dance took everything she had, and walking is still difficult and exhausting. But she doesn't regret a single moment of the fight it took to get there. The video of her dance with Lily has been viewed millions of times online. She receives messages weekly from people facing their own impossible battles, thanking her for showing them what determination looks like. But Margaret doesn't think of herself as special. She thinks of herself as a grandmother who kept a promise. Nothing more, nothing less. "We all have something we think is impossible," she said in an interview 6 months after the wedding. "Something we've been told can't happen. Something we've maybe even stopped believing in ourselves. But I learned that impossible just means no one's done it yet. It means the path is harder. It means you'll fall more times than you can count. But it doesn't mean never. It just means not yet." She paused and smiled. "And if an old woman like me can dance at her granddaughter's wedding after 20 years in a wheelchair, then maybe your impossible thing isn't quite as impossible as you think. So the next time you're facing something that feels impossible, remember Margaret Sullivan. Remember that promises kept with love have power that medicine can't explain. Remember that sometimes the people who believe in us can see things we can't see ourselves. And remember that impossible isn't a fact. It's just an opinion. And opinions can be proven wrong.